So welcome everyone to the Pollinator Garden Design Workshop. We're so happy that you joined us today. My name is Dinah Mack. I'm the Education Program Manager with Massachusetts Farm to School. And if you're not familiar with Massachusetts Farm to School, we work with local farms and fisheries and schools, and our goal is to promote healthy communities by increasing food purchasing, local food purchasing, and farm to school education and food system education in schools. There's a lot of ways we can get involved with Mass Farm to School. We have PD throughout the year. We do a lot of social networking, policy and advocacy work, and community work. And so please, if you're not familiar with us, get in touch. And today I'm very happy to introduce our presenter, Richard Dalidowitz, who is a URI Master Gardener. Richard is a retired chemical engineer with an extensive science background. He has been involved in gardening since an early age, inspired by two uncles who planted the seeds and love of gardening. And Richard, as I said, is a URI Master Gardener 2016. We're not going to be sending out the slide deck for this session. We're going to be sending out the video. If there's anything that you want to access in Richard's slide deck, please email Richard directly and ask for a specific information or graph or image that you're interested in. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Richard is going to start sharing. And Bobby, do you want to introduce yourself before Richard starts?
Sure. I'm Bobby Yoles. I'm the president of the board of directors for Massachusetts Agriculture in the Classroom. And we teach teachers about agricultural education so that they can share that information with their students. That's the short form. We do workshops and have mini grants for agricultural projects within your school or classroom. So if you haven't heard of us, you can go to the website, see our website, see if something interests you. Thanks.
Bobby, do you want to mention, before Richard starts, you want to mention the book?
Yes. If you would like to have a book on pollinator friendly gardens, then if you need more information than what Richard is going to be giving you, because he's going to give you ideas of some plants to use in your garden that will actually attract native pollinators and honeybees. But if you would like a book about pollinator friendly gardens, if you would email, and I'll put the address in the chat. If you would email me, then after the presentation is over, I can send you a book, because I'm going to need your delivery information, which we did not collect on registration. Thanks.
And one last thing is, again, because Richard is not going to be, we're not sending the slide deck out. You might want to have a pen and paper handy to take some notes during this presentation, but I will be sending the recording out. All right, Richard, take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank everybody for Zooming in today. Hopefully you're going to develop a passion for this topic as I have. I started out as a very traditional gardener, and when I took my URI Master Gardening course, one of the big themes was actually native plants, and obviously the pollinators that are attracted to native plants. I really like the opportunity to speak for this group because my wife manages a small giving garden, 20 by 30, and each year it produces around 700 to 850 pounds of produce that's given to a soup kitchen. So as you can see, if you do things right, and it does take a little bit of work to do things right, it's an evolutionary process, you can certainly get some very tremendous yields if everything's clicking. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of content at you, but I would ask you to focus on basically some of the main themes that I'm going to stress, because that's the foundation that you really want to build on. Okay, so let's get started. my objectives are to hopefully give you an understanding of the role that pollinators play in the garden landscape ecosystem, tips on how to attract and sustain the pollinators in your garden, and also suggested plants and what is necessary for them to thrive. So, how do I get rid of all the debris at the top?
Oh,
I've got a masthead.
we don't see the masthead. We just see the slides. You mean the stuff from the Zoom that says
Mute, stop video.
you can move it out of the way. You can slide it up if it's in the
Okay.
way of your presentation.
All right, I'm just gonna go with it, okay?
All right.
Because I know the content pretty well. Okay, so there's been an ongoing debate about how we garden and how we landscape and actually how we farm and steward the land, and that's a key word, steward. We want to be good stewards of the land, and it's been triggered by a very well documented crisis with these pollinators. We've got the monarch butterfly, we've got the European honeybee, and we have bats. And all of them have really been in decline and have faced crises. Although Leopold says, our ability to perceive quality in nature begins as in art with what is pretty, and it expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. So I think in the past, gardening and landscaping has been the main 3 points, I think, pretty much where you want your garden to be pretty to look at, you want to have minimal upkeep, and you want to use pesticides as needed. Heaven forbid an insect flies into your garden because, you know, all the bells go off. And so nature's prescription drugs in effect are pesticides and in some cases herbicides. So I think while we all love and we're inspired by beauty, I'm asking each of you today to consider an alternative approach, a form follows function approach, an ecological approach. And this has been prompted by Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware, who wrote a book called Bringing Nature Back Home, and others. He's focusing on the fact that our gardens, our properties, are something bigger than just our own. They're a key unit in a bigger ecosystem of plants and fauna. And by the way, that ecosystem includes us. So how we garden really does impact our quality of life. So an ecosystem is a group of interconnected elements which interact in a community of organisms with their environment. Components of a garden ecosystem include, obviously, plants, animals, microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, soil, rocks, minerals, water sources, and the atmosphere. So this combination of biotic and abiotic factors work as a system. They're really integrated with each other via nutrient cycles and energy flows. And the nutrient cycles and energy flows are the key connection between the plants we're going to talk about and pollinators. Okay, so our little backyard ecosystem, insects are the engines responsible for the pollination of flowers. There's some exceptions, obviously. Self-pollinating plants, some of your tomato plants, for example, are pretty much self-pollinating. You can actually shake them around, vibrate them, and they'll do some pollinating by themselves. But water and wind are also elements that provide pollination. Other species, not just insects, may also be responsible for pollination. Bats, birds, are also key pollinators. So what is pollination? I'm sure most of you probably know what it is, but for the sake of being thorough, I want to cover this. Pollination is the transfer of pollen, which is a protein-containing material of a plant species to ensure that the plant continues to exist. So in other words, the plant is actually self-preserving itself in this process. Plants are pollinated as insects move pollen grains from the male portion of the plant to the female portion. And that creates offspring by making flowers and seeds that contain the genetic information to produce a new plant. And that's kind of an interesting point, because if you stop and think about it, the plant will be pure if the pollen from one plant goes to that same plant. But if you have varieties of the breed that are pollinated, you'll get some slight variations. And that's where you get into what they call nativars and cultivars. They've been cross-pollinated, and they will be slightly different from the original plant. It's really pretty amazing the way that works. But flowers must rely on certain vectors: wind, water, birds, insects, butterflies, bats, for this process to occur. Now, it's important to bear in mind that, maybe not important, but I think it's interesting that pollination is an unintended consequence. Bees aren't going there and saying, oh, gee, I think I'm going to pollinate this particular plant. They're actually collecting food in the form of pollen for its protein and nectar for carbohydrate. And so they're actually feeding themselves and feeding their offspring. So when the animal visits another plant, that pollen is obviously going to fall off onto the flower stigma and may result in successful reproduction of a flower. May not. Some pollinators are a lot sloppier than others. If you've watched the bumblebee kind of lumber over a plant, you'll see that, they're not precise. They could never end up doing brain surgery. So what are some of the pollinators? We have the European honeybees, which were imported about 400 years ago. They live in colonies. We also have 4,000 native species of ground and twig nesting solitary bees. Bumblebees, small colonies that are usually underground. If you've disturbed a bumblebee colony, you know what that's like, not very pleasant sometimes. You have sweat bees, which are usually solitary, loose colonies, and there are others. Carpenter bees, mason bees are some of the more prominent. Butterflies are another pollinator. They're attracted to brightly colored flowers. They like to position in full sun. They like to be protected from the elements. They need open areas where they can bask, which provides some protection, and some bare dirt. They like wet, muddy areas. And in fact, butterflies or their larvae may damage host plants slightly. So in the case of milkweed, if you've ever seen milkweed plants where you have pollinators in the neighborhood and they found the milkweed, the leaves are gonna look pretty ragged. In fact, in some cases, when we only had one milkweed plant in our side garden near the patio in the shade, it was almost gone by mid-season. So moths are less colorful than butterflies, and they have other preferences. They like strong smelling flowers that open in the late afternoon, evening. So they're more a dusk type of pollinator, and they like flowers that are typically white or pale colored. You have beetles, not very efficient, make a mess. They like strong scented plants. Flies seek out small flowers that bloom under shade, and they like seasonably moist habitats. Birds, the most common bird that we think of are hummingbirds. They have long beaks. They're constructed, long beaks and tongues, to pull the nectar from tubular type, tropical type flowers. Hummingbirds cannot see red. hummingbirds can see red, bees cannot. Bats primarily do their pollinating work in the Southwest with agave and cactus. Okay, so why are pollinators in decline? Well, habitat loss for one, disease, and excessive and inappropriate pesticide application. Now, if you think about these three, they are somewhat interrelated. There's a lot of there's a symbiotic relationship between these three. So what you end up having is you end up having development. The land is basically stripped bare. That sets it up for invasives to come in. Invasives, if you look along the roadside and you see that tall, 6-foot-high grass called Phragmites, you'll see them where there's been habitat disturbance, where there's been some kind of development and then the land has naturally resprouted. Disease, for the most part, particularly with the honeybees, has come about because honeybees are used massively to pollinate crops. And they're almost like it's a funny thing because they move these hives, huge amounts of bees, from spot to spot, depending on what needs to be pollinated. And that has really been stressing out the bees. And that leads to disease. And I think the food supply, because of habitat loss, has made them weaker and led to disease. Then you've got pesticides superimposed on that, which I think is another issue. And then if you end up using some of the herbicides, for example, that are used now on crops like Roundup, you end up killing a lot of the desirable plants that, even though they might not be essential for farming and food production, they are essential for pollinators, either for food or whatever. And many of those plants are native plants, so they're being stripped out of the environment. So these are somewhat interrelated, and I think they play off of each other to explain the decline. So how do we attract pollinators and sustain them in our garden and landscape? Well, you give them what they need, and you provide the most favorable habitat possible. And that habitat consists of three elements: food, shelter, and water. So, quick tips: habitat, food. Flowers provide the nectar and the pollen, the carbohydrate, the energy, and the protein. But they also, pollinators get food from fermenting fallen fruit that are just laying on the ground. They get it from host plants. They get it, and they prefer plants that are in groups. Stop and think about it. I mean, would you go to a different grocery store for each item that you are going to buy for your weekly shopping list? No, you like to go to a place that has, that's just a mass of plantings. So I think you want to plant in groups, pretty much like nature. When you see nature, you see them colonize, and they're in groups, and that makes the job easier for pollinators. And they're brighter than we think they are. And you want to plant also, I think, with bloom season in mind. You want to have something early, in the middle of the season, and late. And plant a diversity of plants to attract different pollinators if you have the capability. Non-native herbs and annuals are very good: mint, oregano, garlic, chives, parsley, lavender. Old-fashioned zinnias, the single bloom, not the double bloom, the hybridized versions, but the old-fashioned blooms like zinnias, cosmos, single sunflowers, those are preferred. Those are what the pollinators have an association with, and that's what they gravitate toward. And of course, minimize or eliminate pesticides. And I know that's tough to do, but if you can minimize, that'd be great. If you can eliminate, even better. Okay, so here's an example of a URI Master Gardener little mini garden that attracts pollinators and monarchs. So you've got the butterfly milkweed, which is very desirable for the monarchs and caterpillars. In the fall, you've got the asters and the goldenrod. And asters and goldenrod are really, they're dynamite in terms of pollinating plants. And then you have a grass in the center, which is called little blue stem, which is a very, very desirable and very nice grass. So you can see that you've kind of covered the season. Nothing here is particularly early, but it's drought tolerant and it likes full sun. And it can be compact. And you can see again the way the plants have been clustered in groups of similar plants so that they provide efficiency for the pollinators. And here's a little bit more detail about each of them. You know, these are designed to be, and this was designed to give you a somewhat attractive, I'll leave a little bit of time so you can copy these down if you want, but they provide an attractive, tidy landscape, I think, for a small, it could be a small island garden in your yard that you've set off in the turf and edged it off well to kind of define it. And it will also attract the pollinators. Okay, so shelter. Pollinators need protection from severe weather and predators, as well as they need nesting and roosting sites. We all like to have, I think, neat, tidy gardens and landscaping, but I think you need to leave a few rough spots somewhere in your landscape. It says here, number 3 is leave dead snags for nesting sites and leaf litter for shelter. So I think if you, for example, one thing that you could do is you could mulch leaves and use that as a little bit of a, as a mulch or ground cover on some of your beds. And not only does it add some valued nutrients and organic material to your bed, but it also takes care of the pollinators. You try to incorporate or keep the garden in a place where you have different canopy layers. That could be a shrub that's higher. The butterflies will come in and they usually zero in on something by going to a high point, kind of scope out the area and see what's in, and then they go for the plants. You could build bee boxes, which I'll show you some pictures of. And if you Google it on the internet, you'll find plenty on bee boxes, easy to build. They are really great for solitary, non-aggressive bees. And I would leave some areas uncovered so you have bare soil, so that ground nesting insects have access to underground tunnels. And we talked about grouping plantings, and I think you want to include some plants that are needed by butterflies, and we'll show you a few of them later on that butterflies can use during their larval development when they're in the caterpillar stage. Okay, nobody has a landscape like this. This is from the Rachel Carson Preserve in Wells, Maine. If you want to read a great book, Silent Spring was written by Rachel Carson. There's a great documentary about her too, about her travels in Maine, and it demonstrates the different layers of vegetation. You could see that this is the way nature operates. It's got the ground story with the low growing plants. It has some very, very nice shrubs. The one in the foreground actually looks like a spice bush. And it's got, of course, the high canopy trees. Perfect for birds, perfect for pollinators, perfect habitat for all natural species, and a great place to walk. You can see the path leading in, just the way it's set up is wonderful. So this is just a tip too, as before we get into the plants. If appearance is a priority, consider this three-pronged approach. Amplify, plant in clusters and drifts. Frame, which means to outline or use edging. It could be stone, mulch, gravel, a walkway, or turf to define the planting area. And of course, you're going to have to edit. With native plants, if they take off, they will colonize. And if they thrive, you're going to have to remove some of the excess, give them to your friends, start them in another garden, put them on the edge of the woods if you have that, depending on what conditions, but you're going to want to edit if you want to keep everything really looking tidy. It's going to give you good visual impact, and it's going to also kind of minimize the informality that native gardens tend to have by their very nature. Okay, here's amplification. This is what I mean by amplifying. This is the way nature works. Two great colors together, yellow and purple. They really work off of each other. That's a stunning, you've got Helianthus in the foreground, and I think that might be one of, I'm not even sure what it is. I'm going to pass on that. I'm not going to make a fool out of myself. Okay, so again, here's that same concept again that we talked about, the tree, the midground, which is in purple, which is small trees and large shrubs. Foreground, small shrubs, ground layer 6 inches. I may be overdoing this. I think everybody understands the concept. Here's the bee boxes. They're like hotels for bees. Essentially what they are is a birdhouse that's open on one or both sides. They have, depending on the type of bee, various diameters of tubing. Could be tubing, could be bamboo, could be rods, could be holes drilled into wood, whatever. The bees come in the idea is the bees come in at the end of the season, they pack the other side with some mud, they lay their eggs, and then they pack the front, and when the young develops, they break out of the bee hotel. And this is basically kind of a breeding ground for bees. And it's pretty cool. It takes a while, I think, to get established and to attract the bees because they need to be in the vicinity. But it's a great concept. I've seen it in play. It took, in reality, it takes a year or two to get established, but then it's quite fascinating and a great teaching tool. Okay, the last part of habitat is water. Pollinators do need some water. You don't have to have an elegant pool or whatever. You can have a shallow sloping container so that pollinators can approach the water without drowning. They want to be able to, like a child, think of a child's wading pool, you know, where you can kind of come in and make your entrance into the water. Okay, if you're serious about attracting pollinators, you should really utilize plant areas, use plants that are native to your area, or at the very least, non-invasive for your area. And invasives have gotten to be a big deal lately because for the simple reason that invasive plants are the first ones to sprout in the spring, and they're the last ones to die down in the fall. And they consume a lot of the resources that the natives and other plants need. They are predators, in effect, that really consume nutrients and everything else. and they have a knack for spreading through rhizomes, which are underground roots, voraciously through a landscape. They will just take over. Okay, so pollinators do have preferences. They're attracted based on color, odor, whether there's nectar, the type of pollen, and the flower shape, which is amazing when you think about it. For example, we're not going to go through the whole slide, but basically, bees are attracted to bright white, yellow, blue, or UV, which they can sense. Birds, scarlet, orange, red, or white color. Butterflies like bright colors, including red and purple. And you'll see that many of the plants that we're going to get into are in the reddish or purplish tone. There's also odor, pollen. There's differences in what they like. Bees like, it's kind of limited, but they often like sticky and scented pollen. And if you ever look at a bumblebee as they're going through their pollination, you could see the pollen just sticking to their body. Flower shape has some function too, because some of the pollinators need some room to work on, somewhere to have a landing pad, if you will, and be able to anchor onto the plant so that they can then go about the task of gathering the pollen. And others are relatively small and they don't need, a large plant with large petals. Okay, here's some of the real hangouts. These are considered to be the best in terms of the number of pollinators they support. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily the best for a specific type of pollinator, but 115 species are attracted to goldenrod, 112 to asters, 73 to the sunflower family, Joe Pye weed and the boneset family, which is in the Eupatorum, they're in the same family, 42, and it goes on and on. Black-eyed Susans, very good, 17. Milkweed, 12, but most notably the monarch. You've got verbena, which is also a very, very strong, it's a purple plant, beautiful plant, and monarchs love it. So again, as you get down toward the bottom, you're going to find that those might be specifically for the monarchs, but when you go up above, you'll see that you have the goldenrod. The other point I'd like to make too, and I didn't list it here because we're talking about herbaceous plants, which are flowering plants, but for the most part, a lot of the trees like oak, a lot of the native trees really provide the primary food for the larvae of insects and for the young. And I didn't include those, but that's an important consideration, because if you have oaks in your, if you have hardwood trees or some of the native trees like the lindens and everything in your landscape or in your yard, that's also going to be a factor in terms of supporting pollinators. Okay, when you get into these plants, some key points you need to be aware of: your soil type, clay, sandy, lots of organic material, no organic material, high pH, low pH, the amount of sunlight you have. Are you in the shade? Is it partial sun, 3 to 6 hours? Do you have full sun, 6 hours or more? And is your soil more moist? Or is it dry? Is it, sometimes you have a backyard, you may have a wooded area that's filled with trees, very mature trees. Not only is it shady, but it's as dry as a bone because the trees are sucking up every last bit of moisture. And so it's just a tangle of surface roots. If you dig down, it's almost impossible to dig down into that yard. So you need to know these in order to select the appropriate plant material. Okay, let's get into them. Early bloomers. Golden Alexanders, called zizia sometimes, moist to wet. This is a larval food for black swallowtails. So you may plant these and you may be very disappointed because you may find that they're decimated by the larva if you do have black swallowtail butterflies in your area. But I think that's part of the game with the monarchs and with the butterflies, is that's an intended consequence of what we're doing here, is to feed them. You've got wild geraniums. Again, the geraniums are pretty good for attracting pollinators, particularly butterflies. You can see the purple flowers, very attractive to them. You've got golden ragwort. This is a nice plant, 12 to 24 inches, likes moist soils. It's sun to shade, it's not very fussy. But it also, key thing, it flowers into mid-spring, which is kind of a dead spot, really, for a lot of plants. There's not much going on before you get into the real eruption in the early part of summer. This is coneflower. This was taken on our front doorstep. You've got a combination of black-eyed Susans. You can see in the background, there's a black-eyed Susan, but this was taken right where the walkway comes into our front stoop to the front entrance. It's a great plant, excellent nectar species for many butterflies, and goldfinches love the seeds. By the end of the season, there's nothing left to this plant except just the stem. It's decimated.
Hey, Richard,
Yes.
there's a question. Someone said, is that the same species of ragwort that people are allergic to?
No, that's ragweed. And a lot of people confuse goldenrod with ragweed. Goldenrod, if it is goldenrod, solidago, it's the genus solidago, does not cause allergies. Normally, it does not cause hay fever, what they call hay fever. But it's a good question, very good question. So you get blue vervain. This is a verbena, again, purple, great for butterflies. It's a kind of a prolific plant. You've got swamp milkweed. This is a very desirable type of milkweed, and a lot more attractive, I think, than the common milkweed that I'm going to show at the end. It's actually more of a horticultural landscaping plant that has great blooms and really fits well into the garden. It's got nectar for in the flower, which is the food for many, many insects. Also kind of tolerant. Let me make a point too about the shade to sun. This says partial shade to sun, but I can guarantee you that if you put it in partial shade, you will not get anywhere near the bloom that you get in sun. So for the most part, I would say, as a general rule, all of these plants are going to show much better flowering in sun than they are in partial shade, even though they can exist. And they won't, but I don't think they'll thrive nearly as much with regard to bloom. Okay, sorry, this is tick seed, Coreopsis tick seed. I do not have a picture. I put this in, I added this late because it's an early to midsummer bloom that comes up. It has 2-inch wide little golden yellow flowers and masses of them. And it's a very, very good plant, again, for pollinators. I just wanted to fill that gap of that mid-season gap when things are kind of, transcending from one season into the next. Okay, now we're getting into some late bloomers. New York ironweed. When you see 36 to 60 inches tall, don't be alarmed. This plant will probably grow in a typical garden to about 36 inches. A lot of these plants, like the New York ironweed, the Joe Pye weed, that show very, very tall growths, the helianthus, the sunflowers, they need almost like semi-marshy conditions. And if they get those conditions along the side of a road and they have to compete in an environment where there's tall plants along the side of the road, they will grow to 6 feet, to 5 feet, to 60 inches. But for the most part, in a regular garden, they won't grow that tall. This is a great plant. You know, I leave it up because even the seed heads, which are relatively small, are still attractive through the winter. Boneset, this is another really good plant. Moist, it's not drought tolerant though, but it likes full sun, July to October, long bloom, great for pollinators. Culver's root, which is Veronica, that's another great one. Nowhere near 36 to 72 though. I can tell you in my garden, it gets up to about 24 to 36 inches. And a lot of these plants, by the way, that I'm showing you, I have experience with. So, you know, I've either grown them or I know people who have grown them. So I know that they work for the most part. This is, again, Veronica will do okay in partial shade, but again, it won't bloom nearly as well as if it gets full sun. And this is one out of my garden. I have the white Veronica. It's in the front, so it gets late afternoon sun and does well. Okay, this is a verbena. It is not native. It's a terrific plant. I can't say enough about this. I think the picture of it to the right captures what it looks like. It grows in little clusters. It is not a perennial. It's one of the few in this group that is not a perennial, but it is self-sowing and it will reseed itself. If you have a little bit of bare ground around it, the seeds, it has so many seeds, as you could see by the number of blooms on this plant, and pollinators just go crazy about this one. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story. How am I doing on time?
You're fine so far, Richard, you're fine.
Okay, we had a garage built and we had a few verbena that were kind of growing wild. And so when they came in, obviously they did the complete clearing of the, picked off the topsoil, all the topsoil and mounded it. And then they took the subsoil and mounded that, built the garage. Then they re-landscaped. And I decided I was going to build a big arcing bed that's about 10 feet wide by about 50 feet long. So I said, please mound the topsoil. So they mounded it. I wanted to have that in front of the actual driveway that goes into the garage. So it kind of gives you a landscape feature. You would not believe the number of verbena seeds that came up when they saw that environment of the topsoil. The seeds were there. They were just waiting for the right conditions. We must have had 100 of these plants pop up the first year. It was incredible. And now we're thinning them out and I'm doing the editing, which I have urged you to do. But those clusters actually, they're not even seeding. Most of them are actually resprouting the next year right from the cluster with multiple stems like you see to the right. Okay, enough about that. You can see I'm enraptured by the verbena. I'll move on. Another picture, this is in our backyard. You can see them, you can see a monarch on them and the monarchs just, cling to them. Purple Joe Pye weed. This is a great plant. Many times you'll see it along the roadside. If you see, for example, a pond or something where they've done excavation at one of the exits off the highway, you'll see this kind of a plant. It's a flat head. It's got a flat head and it's got these pink flowers and little clusters. It's a wonderful plant and it's a great pollinator plant. The asters. This is the New York American aster. There's a bunch of asters. What I would recommend, another thing I would recommend too is if you're going to go out and buy asters and you see a particular aster you want, don't buy it if it just says aster on it, because a lot of times that's all the information you're going to see. I would try to be a little bit more specific. If it says New York aster or New England aster, and that's the one you're looking for, that's okay. Better yet to see the actual Latin name underneath to be sure you're really getting, you know, what you're looking for, because you might be disappointed. Gray goldenrod, this is the end of the season, gets up to 36 inches tall. There are a lot of great goldenrod. There's smooth goldenrod, there's the gray goldenrod. They're good, but I would say that they're more better for, if you will, for, excuse my grammar, for naturalistic landscaping than they are for a small garden, because they tend to be a little bit tall and rangy. So I would stay with some of the lower varieties, but I wanted to include goldenrod because it really is relied on by many of the butterflies before they do their migration. This is where they fuel up in the fall before they leave. So I think these are key plants. This, the New York, the ironweed is a key plant. The Joe Pye weed, they're key plants for the end of the season when the butterflies are storing up and getting energy for moving from our area. Okay.
Richard, wait,
Yeah.
before you move on, there's a question in the chat that says, for the plants that you are highlighting, can they be planted in flat earth beds or are raised beds recommended?
Yeah, I think I have mixed feelings about raised beds. I'm not a raised bed type of person, but they can be raised in raised beds. I don't think there's a problem with that. I have an 8x8 raised bed, and I take many of my surplus plants and I put them in there and they do well. They do great. I mean, I even have a full-sized, I found some little baby American hollies, Ilex opaca, and I put them in about 2 years ago, and they were probably about this tall. They're now about 3.5 feet tall, perfect shape. It's a good holding spot. You know, I use it as a holding spot. You can put it in a raised bed. It depends on what you're planting. If you're planting vegetables in the raised bed, they might really compete aggressively, some of these plants, with the vegetable plants. But I'm not saying that's a bad thing either, because there's an author called, trying to think, her last name is West, and Cynthia West, I think, Claudia West. And she talks about the fact that plants like colonies, and they really don't like to be separated. They like to be bunched in with other plants because their roots operate at different levels in the ground and they have different needs. And there's this concept about colonization, which is why she is the big component. She actually advanced the component about amplify, edit, and frame. That was her concept. And so she plants in mass clusters. So I kind of prefer flat beds, but raised beds work. If that's the only option that you have, and for many people I know that may be the only option, it could be a patio garden, or it makes it easier for a person to garden. You know, they don't have to stoop down as much, or even for kids, it's easier for them to work in a raised bed.
Um,
Does-
Richard, you have some other questions coming in, and just to be cognizant of time, it's 4:50, we're going till 5:30, and I want to make sure you get through your material, so I'll just give you these questions now, and then you can
Sure.
you can see if you can answer them. One of them, I'll give you both. One says, one native plant expert suggests that you should burn the native plant area every 2 to 3 years. What do you say? Is this recommended? And then the other question says, would you recommend planting native plants alongside vegetables and fruits like companion planting, or stick with mass cluster?
Okay, those are two good questions. I'm not an expert on burning. I know that that's a concept that's used for native grasses, where they will burn them down. I think part of that is to it puts nutrients, very valuable mineral type nutrients, back into the soil. So there is something to be said for that. It gives you a clean slate to start with. So if you've got a tangle in your native plant area, that gives you a clean slate. I know a lot of people that do native plants and they don't burn, and they have great success. So I think, I just don't know enough about it to give a preference one way or the other. But I don't think you have to do it. It's certainly, I've seen plenty of native plant gardens that are thriving without burning down. But there are proponents of it that feel that it's very beneficial in terms of building up the soil. And at the end of the day, one of the things you really want to do is you want to build up the soil. If you compost, composting is very, very valuable. If you compost leaves, if you shred leaves and you use them as mulch, that's very valuable. And why is it valuable? It's valuable because compost does not provide a lot of fertilizer, a lot of nitrogen, but what it does provide is organic material. And organic material is crucial for soil building, and the sites on that organic material bind fertilizer. So if you think about the two extremes of soil with a lot of organic material in it and sand, if you put fertilizer, if you fertilize, you take water, you fertilize sand, what's going to happen? It's going to run through, and that's it. You're going to waste it. If you look at organic material that has a lot of sites, ionic sites where there's bonding, there's actually chemical bonding between the fertilizer and the organic sites on the organic material, the ionic sites. You're going to hold that fertilizer until the plant needs it and it can be released. Okay, enough on that. The second question was?
The second question was, would you recommend planting native plants alongside vegetables and fruits like companion planting, or stick with the mass cluster?
I would go with, well, okay. So if you're going for pollination, I would go with the mass planting. If you're looking for repellent qualities, for example, repelling insects, then I think companion, like marigolds, are one example. If you're looking for a specific characteristic of a plant that will repel insects, certain types of insects, or let's put it this way, discourage them, then I would do the companion planting. But I think the ideal answer would be do both. If you can have a little area where you could put a cluster, maybe early season, mid-season, because really for most vegetable gardening, that's when it's going to happen, right? You're going to happen in the late spring, early summer, where there's going to be pollination and everything. I think you want to draw the pollinators. I would put in mid-season, late spring, early summer, and then, don't worry about the late season if you're focused on vegetable gardening. That's if you're focused on that. Okay? I hope that answers the question well.
Yeah, that sounded great. So, all right. Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
woodland sunflowers, Helianthus, moist, dry soil, drought tolerant. One thing that I'm looking for that's in the same family is the sunchoke or Jerusalem artichoke. And that is a great, for a garden, that is a great plant. We used to have them on our property and we got rid of them. That was before I was enlightened about native plants. And I was enlightened more about, food like rhubarb and artichokes and garlic and everything else. So, if you want to experiment, have fun. Jerusalem artichoke has a beautiful flower, just like this woodland sunflower, except it's a little taller. And then, of course, you've got the turtle head, which, as you can see from the picture, it actually looks like a turtle head popping out from under the shell. That's a key larval food for the checker spot butterfly, and it blooms from July to September, and it's a really knockout plant. So, if that's something you want to experiment with, buy one, see how you like it, see if it takes, and then, and go from there. Okay, so this is our front. I was telling you about our front entryway. This was something that we planted. We planted 1 or 2 plants, and you could see that they were happy. You've got the black-eyed Susans, and you've got the coneflowers. And there's a few other plants that come up mid-season and they're long gone. And some of you are probably going to see an invasive in back of them. That in back of the coneflowers, you'll see that burgundy colored. I will admit that is a Japanese barberry. So guilty as charged. Fortunately, it doesn't spread badly. Okay. Here again is, this is the common milkweed. This is in back of our screened-in porch. There's a little border. It's in the shade. It's somewhat protected, and you can see the larva feeding on the milkweed plant, and you can see the condition of the leaves. And, they're actually in pretty good shape, in my opinion, considering previous years. Here's another picture of milkweed that's showing the blooms. And this is in a URI master garden. It's the Charlestown Schoolhouse Garden near the Charlestown, Rhode Island library. And they have a 1-room schoolhouse that's kind of a cool place to visit. And they have a little complex with this garden, the schoolhouse, the library garden, and it's a pretty neat place. Okay, shrubs. Gonna go quick.
Richard, there's another question before you go to shrubs. I have a last question about native flowers. Someone asked, any recommendation what to do if bunnies eat all your native flowers when they grow in the spring?
Cry. I would cry. I've been there, done that. I can't tell you how many times we've had that happen. We have a lot of rabbits. Okay, number one, we have a lot of rabbits. It's selectivity in what you plant. And again, what I found is I believe in a patchwork lawn. So I leave some weeds, I leave some, I do not have pure bluegrass, fescue, grass. I don't have the greatest lawn, but I've got a good lawn, a green lawn. You have to have something for the bunnies to nibble on. If you have a perfect lawn and you try to plant a lot of these native plants and you don't protect them when they're young, and I can tell you, my wife has all kinds of hardware mesh, little cages around them until they get big enough. You have to really protect them. It's if the bunnies are attracted to them, and that's a little bit of trial and error, regrettably. But I think if you protect them and they get big enough, I had that problem with, believe it or not, an oak leaf hydrangea, which grows to be 8 feet tall. It's a shrub. It's a beautiful shrub. And we planted, I did some cuttings and I planted it and it was eaten. It just kept, I've moved it 4 times and I finally protected it and it's now 6 feet tall. But, you know, you got to baby these, you got to protect them until they get off to, you know, they get established. And even then, I mean, if the rabbits have nothing else, they're probably going to go to your plants, like your desirable plants. So that's a tough question. I wish I had the answer. I'd be probably a millionaire. But you can use different repellents. You could use, you know, try the garlic repellents and, you know, some of those things that they have. They have a lot of homemade formulas that you can do your own chemistry and mix them up and try them. You know, a lot of them use eggs because of the sulfur smell, or onions because of the sulfur smell, which is repellent to the rabbits. That's the best I got. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer. This is a cool little shrub. I got onto it about a couple of years ago. It's called the spice bush. The reason why I'm putting it here is because it is one of the first plants you could see. You can see this picture. There's almost nothing else out but the evergreens and the bulbs in the background, the spring bulbs. This shows a flash of yellow, just multiple tiny blossoms that are the first real food for many of the butterflies when they come in. So it's a great shrub. It will thrive in shade, by the way. So if you have a woodland garden with a high tree canopy, it will bloom because none of the trees really have sprouted out at this point, and it's a neat native. High bush blueberry. Blueberries are a phenomenal plant for pollinators. Again, the problem with blueberries are that you've got to protect them from the birds. That's a constant struggle. You have to really net them. They don't adapt very well to a garden. We've gotten to a point where I prize them for their for the fact that they feed the birds and that they have this terrific burgundy colored foliage in the fall, which rivals anything. Summer sweet, great shrub. This is a butterfly magnet. If you're going to plant it, it'll grow in partial shade, but again, it blooms much better in sun. July to August, it's a native. If you're going to plant it and you have a patio or a screened-in porch or a deck, plant it next to your deck. The blossoms are like perfume. It smells like it's just phenomenal. It's a great shrub, nice looking shrub, tidy. It's bunched together, very. It's not compact, but it's very full. It's not a highly twiggy type shrub, which sometimes looks kind of, you know, not very good in the landscape. Okay, white butterfly bush. This is a non-native. This is a picture I took. It's in our front patio. We have a stone patio, and it's very protected. It's very warm because of the bluestone that holds the heat. And so unlike the common butterfly bush, which is somewhat invasive, this survives the whole year and does not proliferate into a 10-foot high shrub. It stays pretty small, 4 by 4. This one is the only, well, it's not the only one, but because it's again near an entryway, the hummingbirds are really attracted to this. This is a plant that the hummingbirds will look for nectar in. And, just a great overall shrub. And buttonbush, this is not easy to find, but this is a very desirable shrub for pollinators. It's got a great as you can see, the blossoms are very unique, and it's got a nice shape to it. This is Itea, Virginia sweetspire. It's a mid-season, early summer to midsummer type shrub. It's got great fall foliage, red or very vivid yellow. It's got these spires of white blossoms, which are, very, again, desirable for pollinators. This one is ninebark. Ninebark is a great native shrub. It's in the rose family. The only caution I would caution is give it a little bit of room. They tend to have arching branches, overarching branches, and they do get a little big. And you've got to kind of rejuvenate them. The ones that are getting a little bit out of control, cut them back to the base. They will, because they're so somewhat vigorous, they will come right back and you'll never know the difference. But you do have to tame them by pruning. Okay, few final thoughts before we leave. Research your plants carefully before buying. Rely on .edu internet sites, which are usually extension services of universities. They're not selling plants, they're giving you solid information. Understand your plant needs. I don't think I have to tell you enough. This is one of those situations where right plant, right place. I can't tell you how many times I've picked up a plant, moved it because I put it in the wrong place. So that leads me into my next point. Gardening is both experiential and somewhat experimental. So when you buy plants, they're not a sure thing. They need to be happy. And I think I've given you some ideas on how to make them happy. But I also think that you have to do a little bit of experimenting. And I think you have to learn. You may find that there may be a plant that you just can't grow in your landscape. And like I said before, if possible, protect those small plants, because there's a lot of critters that are hungry out there that will go after your plants. And native plants purchased outside of the New England ecoregion may not be the most suitable choice for our area. And that's because of the next point, which is about nativars. Okay. That's because of the concept of nativars. Nativars are bred for enhanced unusual characteristics. So they are actually like the hybrids of like an azalea. They're a specially bred plant that have been either somehow cross-pollinated or whatever to produce a desirable trait. And I will give you an example. The winterberry. The winterberry is the shrub. It's a native shrub, beautiful, that you may see in plantings that have these red berries that persist into the winter. So it looks like a little tree, about anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall, and it's got red berries. At Beechwood, which is a native plant garden in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, there are 3 different varieties of winterberry. And one of them is 2 of them are what we'd call a nativar. One is just a natural species. One of the nativars, they all had red berries, but one of the nativars had much bigger red berries. They looked like mini marbles. In the spring, the natural, typical native plants had no berries left. The nativar with the bigger berries had all the berries. The birds, just for whatever reason, the berries were too big or whatever. My speculation is that they couldn't associate with the plant. Remember, everything we talked about here is an ecosystem. there is an association of all of these insects, birds, whatever, an association that they've developed over the years with the plants. These are go-to type plants and habitats and regions for them. They will come back year after year, I think. Once you draw them to your property, they have an association now and they will come back.
Richard, there's a question in the chat
Sure.
if you could address, which is what would you recommend for a school pollinator garden? If someone was starting out with students and wanted to, think of like the top plants that they could put in there.
Okay, it's funny. Okay, so that's a really good question. And, what I would do is I would take I would start off small because I designed the garden for the Kingston Free Library, which is right on the URI, almost on adjacent to the URI campus. They had two areas. They have a stone building. It was the original library. And on either side of the entryway, the stone steps, they have roughly a 4.5 foot deep by 8 foot spot of soil on either side. It's not a lot to work with. And so I went with a lot of the plants that I've mentioned here. I went with the coneflower. I went with so if someone wanted to email me, I could show them that, give them that plant, that plan, which is planted in drifts, which had, I think there was, a New York ironweed was in it in the back, toward the back. I think it depends on how you want to set it up. If you want to set it up as an island, you could have the tall plants in the center, have the smaller plants around the side, use some of the taller plants like the Joe Pye weed, the New York. Well, okay. And again, this is for a school garden, so school pollinator garden. So the New York ironweed doesn't come out till the fall. So with that might not be useful. Maybe depending on when the group would see it, that would be a factor too. I don't know if that would be practical to have a fall, plants coming out in the fall when, the late summer when kids may not be there. But that's a good question. I mean, if you send me your email, I will give you some suggestions, okay? And I'll work off of that small garden that I did for the library. I hope that answers the question, but any of these would really work well, I think. The ones I would probably, there's some that I didn't even talk about, which like the cardinal flower is a great flower. There's, it's tough. I mean, send me an email and I'll give you some short, tall, medium-sized plants that you could put in.
That would be great. I just put Richard's email in the chat right above.
I can't stress enough too, I'm a visual person. I'm a visual learner. I can't stress enough the fact that you really want to work from a plan. You really want to do a layout before you plant. With that said, some of the best landscape architects I've seen have the plan and they've laid it out. They kind of know where they're going. But when they finally start putting the plants down and looking at them, they start tweaking them a little bit. Not much, but they tweak them or they say, gee, I like that a little bit more here or whatever. So, do a plan, put a plan together, and then set your plants out after you get them to verify how they're going to look, and then tweak them. Because this is, like I said, this is experimental and it's experiential, and you really learn by doing. Now, on this slide, I've put up a few of the sources. The Xerces Society is great for butterflies. That's their specialty. The pollinator partnership, the graph that that little chart that I showed you was from the pollinator partnership. And then this is from the pollinator partnership too, I believe. These handouts, I don't think you can see it, but they have bees, best plants for bees. They have a whole series of these handouts that are really, really pretty cool. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they have a lot of good things for pollinators for vegetable gardens. Believe it or not, they have some excellent resources. The New England Native Plant Initiative is also very good. URI.edu, they have a plant guide. Rhode Island, they have a native plant guide. It says Rhode Island native plant. I don't go by states. I like to think in terms of regions, larger ecoregions. I consider Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut to be a region. Some folks like Donald Leopold considers the Northeast. He expands the region to the Northeast. There's considerable debate, and sometimes it's quite heated about what is a native plant. But I like to think in a larger sense than just the state. And then the Monarch Watch is a very, very interesting where you can get a habitat certification by fulfilling certain things. That might be an interesting project for schools, is to put together something where then you could get certified that it's kind of like those pollinator corridors that are coming together. There's a pollinator corridor down in Southwest Connecticut in Trumbull, where the town actually funded plants to promote the corridor, and people put in the plants, and they have a corridor that's going up along the from the southwest, all the way up to the northwest part of Connecticut. That's a pollinator corridor that's certified. The books that I like, there's a ton of books out there. Native Plants of the Northeast, that's kind of my reference guide, but I would recommend the last book, which is Native Plants for New England. It's a paperback, and it is actually put out by the New England Wildflower Society, and it's The Garden in the Woods. Are you familiar with The Garden in the Woods in Massachusetts in Framingham? If you're not, you should go to it. It's in Framingham, Mass. Garden in the Woods. They have tours. It's native plants in their native setting, and they also have a great store for selling native plants. And I think for tours, you have to obviously book a tour, but it's a great experiential place to be, and the people are pretty high powered, that are there, and they know probably 50 times what I know about native plants, but that's a great resource. And then, of course, the book I mentioned, Bringing Nature Home, Doug Tallamy has been a pioneer on this whole eco gardening. He's a professor at the University of Delaware, great educator. I heard him speak at a URI and Master Gardener annual meeting, very inspirational guy. I'm sure that he has a bunch of YouTube videos out there. So if you Google Doug Tallamy native plants, you'll get a lot of hits. And that's pretty much it. That's my presentation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for having me, and I hope this was helpful.
Richard, we have a few more minutes. If anyone here has any more questions, you can unmute and ask, or throw it in the chat. Oh, here's a question, Richard. It says, I have a space that is a grassy, open air courtyard in the middle of my school, approximately 24 feet by 30 feet. My plan is to build a pollinator garden in this courtyard. Do you think pollinators, bees and butterflies will find the garden? The green spaces around the school are all grassy ball fields. So will they find an open air courtyard inside a school?
I think they will eventually. You know, what is the Kevin Costner film? You know, if you build it, they will
Field of
come.
Dreams. Field
Come
of
to
Dreams.
dream. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Field of Dreams.
So pollinators are like that. They'll come.
They're like that. You have to make it worth their while. But I think they will come. You know, if there are fields around it, though, the danger possibly is the fact that there could be herbicides and pesticides depending on how the turf is managed. So if the turf is, aggressively managed for, a beautiful lawn, it could be an issue, but I would go for it. I wouldn't discourage it. I would go for it and, and see what happens.
And you'll have a beautiful courtyard. Anyone else have any other questions? We're getting a lot of thank yous to you,
Okay.
Richard. Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you. So thanks, everyone. And we will be sending out a recording of this. And if there's anything in Richard's slide deck that you would like to have, please get in touch with Richard directly, or if you have a question or need some more advice about your school pollinator garden. And yeah.
And I would say too, a final closing note would be, and in our culture, this is, an attribute that is really not in high supply. You have to be patient. You really have to be patient because you're working with nature, and there are a lot of opposing forces in nature. You have the weather factor, you have the the nibbler factor, the bunnies, the deer, and you just somehow have to figure out a way to get around that. And sometimes that takes time, and there's some disappointment. But I think even from the disappointment, you can learn a lot about the fact that if something eats your garden, you've put something out there that's desirable to that species. So
That's a great closing words, Richard. So thank you, everyone. Stay in touch with Mass Farmer School and Mass Ag in the Classroom and reach out to Richard. And please join us for our other PD throughout the year. And it's great to have everyone here. Hope everyone has excited times planning their pollinated garden. Spring is almost here, so gives you something to do with your students or yourself until spring comes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
bye, everybody.
Thanks, Richard.